Welcome. This is our fourth meetup for New York City for AngularJS. If you don't know, AngularJS is an open source JavaScript framework by Google. The motto is HTML enhanced. I think you'll see that in Mark's presentation. We usually have Igor up here in Mountain View, but he is presenting on Angular in San Francisco right now, so he couldn't be here. But that's okay, because we have an awesome presentation from Mark, and Carl is around somewhere. Who's going to answer a question? Oh, I'm Andrew. I'm a web developer at Google, and we use AngularJS on my project, and I help organize these meetups. So Mark is the tech lead for DoubleClick for advertisers, and Carl is on his team. And he's going to talk about, and he just rebuilt DFA on AngularJS, started 18 months ago, and he's going to present about that. We'll have questions after. Does anybody have any questions now? He'll answer
all that and more will be revealed.
But DoubleClick for advertisers, right?
Yes, DoubleClick for advertisers.
Yeah. So here's Mark.
Ready? Great. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me just fine? All right. So yes, today's talk is about rebuilding DFA with AngularJS. First, let me tell you a bit about myself. My name is Mark Jacobs. I am an engineer at Google, been there about 2.5 years or so. I'm also the tech lead manager, that's that TLM, for a product called DDMM Trafficking FE. And I will explain what that means in case it wasn't patently obvious from the get-go. So what is this talk about? About 18 months ago, actually go back a little bit further. Back in 2008, Google acquired a company called DoubleClick. DoubleClick was a large player in display advertising. And when Google acquired DoubleClick, they also acquired all of their products, many of which in Google language are quite legacy. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But back about 18 months ago, my team was tasked with rewriting this platform and bringing it into the fold of Google technologies. And we chose to use AngularJS for that rewrite. And so in this talk, I'll talk about who we are, what our product is. I'll talk about how we made the choice for Angular, what are the things we looked at. And also we'll dig into what were some of the architectural and design decisions we made after choosing to use Angular. And finally, what we thought worked and didn't work about Angular. The first thing you ought to know is that DFA is pretty big for an AngularJS application. In fact, we believe it's the largest AngularJS application out there. Who knows what somebody's doing in some basement somewhere, but we think it's the largest. It's about 200,000 lines of code. And this number is inclusive of views and tests. But even if you just take into account non-test, non-views, we're nearly at 100,000 lines of code. So it's quite large for an AngularJS application. All right, so what is this mysterious term DDMM Trafficking FE? So the first thing you have to know is that our product was recently rebranded. So it used to be called DFA, DoubleClick for advertisers. So throughout this talk, I may go back and forth between DFA and DDMM. Just know that they're the same thing, broadly speaking. One is a rebranding. DDMM stands for DoubleClick Digital Marketing Manager and is the rebranded new name for what was recently called DoubleClick for advertisers. So what is this DDMM? It is Google's buy-side online display advertising platform for large advertisers and agencies. So let me break this down. So in all advertising, there is a publisher side and a buy side, a sell side and a buy side. So the sell side represents publishers. These are the websites that have advertising inventory to sell. Your New York Times, your blog article, your ESPN, your IGN, whatever it is. On the flip side, you've got advertisers who are figuring out how to optimize for some outcome, whether it's buying widgets or downloading brochures or growing their brand recognition. And they're using publisher, advertisements on this publisher inventory to serve their purpose. So our product, DoubleClick Digital Marketing Manager, represents the advertiser side of that equation. Google has a whole other set of products that represent the publisher side of that equation. Specifically, we're dealing with online display advertising. So advertising in the online world comes in many different flavors. You've got video advertising, you've got social advertising, that is advertising that works within LinkedIn and Facebook and Google Plus and that kind of thing. You've got rich media, which is basically highly interactive ads that can be embedded in movies and games and can fly out and do all kinds of things. So we're specifically dealing with display advertising. So that's like the classical advertising you see when you went, even onto a web page 10 years ago, went to New York Times, there'd be a banner across the top, there'd be an interstitial page that comes on when you go before you read an article. That's basically the nut of display advertising. And unlike Google's other side, the AdWords, which deals with text ads and search ads, our customers are not like mom and pops. If you're a small business, you're probably not going to use our product. We're really catering to the world's largest advertisers and their advertising agencies. Think like Nike, Apple, Marc Jacobs, the famous fashion designer, not me. And of course, their agencies. So, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, when we began, the state of the world was Google acquired DoubleClick. There was a product at that time, it's still in fact out there, it's what most of our customers are using as of right today, called DFA 6, DoubleClick for Advertisers version 6. And just to put this in context, it is an ASP.NET application. It is written in C#, at least the front end portion of it. The middle tier is Java on JBoss. The whole thing runs on Windows. It runs in a data center in Colorado somewhere that's very unlike any Google data center out there. Its data is stored in Oracle. This is not googly in any way, shape, or form. And we worked with that for quite some time. And then about 18 months ago, we were tasked with bringing the whole thing into the Google fold, choosing new technologies to rewrite this platform. And we did this for a number of different reasons. Now, I'll talk a little bit on the next slide, but ultimately, we knew going forward that we wanted to build product faster. We also wanted to improve the look and feel and user experience of these applications. We also had a lot of desire to have more integrations with other products inside of Google. And that was very difficult to do when you're operating in sort of a siloed data center at the other end of the world in Colorado. And you're trying to work with Google APIs and stuff that work in a different data center. So there's a whole host of reasons why we were asked to do this challenge to rewrite the whole thing. At that time, the predominant solution for rewriting a UI technology at Google, certainly within ads at least, was GWT. How many people in the room are familiar with GWT? Okay, so this is a Google Web Toolkit. It basically is a Java-like simulation that targets JavaScript as a runtime environment. So you can basically, in Eclipse, write Java, or almost Java, and compile it, and what you get is a JavaScript application that runs in a browser. So this was really the default solution for ads. And when we began 18 months ago, it seemed obvious we'd use GWT. And then we looked at it, and GWT wasn't a great fit for us for a number of different reasons. I'm not really going to get into a technical comparison about GWT. I'm just going to look at some of the other reasons. For example, on our team, none of us knew GWT. None of us were really Java programmers, so to speak. We were more focused on JavaScript, HTML, modern web development. There was also the reality that with GWT, it was very difficult to go out into the marketplace and find good GWT engineers. When we were, just like in DFA 6, when Google acquired the legacy product, Google couldn't go out and get .NET engineers. The thing with GWT is that while you can find many Java programmers, and you can find many UI programmers, the few rarely collide into a single person. And so as I was growing my team from 2 people to it's about 14 and change nowadays, it didn't seem reasonable that I'd be able to scale quickly, building a team, expecting to find those rare gems that are both Java experts and UI experts. And there's a host of other technical reasons. But ultimately, we started looking at different solutions. We looked at things like Backbone, JavaScript MVC, Knockout. We thought about writing our own JavaScript framework. We did a number of different, we looked at a number of different solutions. We knew we wanted to pick something that was client-side, something based on JavaScript, ideally, MVC, but that's where it stood. About that time, as we're talking about Q4 of 2010, Mishko, who's the TL for AngularJS, gave a tech talk in New York City talking about this early idea for a product called AngularJS. And I caught this tech talk and was really blown away by it. There was a lot of things that I really liked about it. One, it was a declarative solution. In order to define your app using AngularJS, much of the high-level wiring actually happens in the HTML. So, unlike solutions like Knockout or Backbone, where a lot of it is defined in JavaScript, and you're trying to figure out, what the UI maps to some series of JavaScript classes, I think in Angular it was really front and center. You could do things trivial like here's a div and you could put ng:click on it, and that would do a click handler. But you could also have higher level expressions. For example, you can define this entire section is controlled by a controller, which is a JavaScript class, and anything in that section of code can call methods on that controller. One of the other things that was quite different from other products at the time was it had two-way binding. So data binding is not unusual. In fact, if any of you have done UI development in other platforms like .NET or whatever, we get data binding. But I think what was interesting in JavaScript at that time is much of it was one-way data binding. You could go from a model into the view, and then if you modified an input and you wanted to update the model, you were pretty much on your own to figure out how to do that. I think AngularJS was really the first one that made two-way data binding out of the box really easy. I just simply say this input box is bound to this particular property on a model, and whether you update the model programmatically or update the input by typing, the model will always be kept in sync with the UI. So I thought that was really great. Another thing is it used plain old JavaScript objects. So another framework, Knockout, has a lot of nice qualities to it, especially its dependency tracking framework. But what you end up with is a bunch of class overhead. Same thing with Backbone. You have to derive your controller from this class. In Knockout, you have to sort of wrap all your properties as dependency objects. I had done some Microsoft work too. If anybody familiar with WPF or Silverlight, same kind of idea in Knockout. It was very attractive, but ultimately, when you're trying to figure out how am I going to grow a team, how am I going to teach a bunch of new people this technology, the idea that you have just plain old JavaScript classes without a lot of base classes and without a lot of artifice seemed to be a really good idea. As well, at that time, a lot of the team was very familiar with jQuery, and Angular. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but Angular has embedded in it a jQuery compatibility layer, and furthermore, if you actually use the real jQuery, it can use that too. And it's pretty much the documented way of interacting with the DOM within widgets and directives. And for us, that seemed very comfortable. We knew how to use jQuery, and the fact that it worked with that seemed to be a good payoff. And one of the other things that just blew me away, probably more than anything, was that Angular had a full testing story. This is very unusual for many of the other frameworks. From the very get-go of Mishko's talk way back when, he was showing this is how I run my unit tests, this is how I do test-driven development, this is how I do a integrated end-to-end test using Angular scenarios. This is how we do dependency injection, so we can mock out particular classes. These were not novel ideas, but it was a novel integration of those ideas into a JavaScript world. And I think more than anything else, when you're thinking about building a very large application, again, 200,000 lines of code, having something out of the box that tells you, all right, it's going to be okay, this is how you're going to test it, this is how you're going to run your test suites, I think that was a very compelling argument. And lastly, it's a straightforward architectural model. We can debate whether or not it's truly MVC, or whether a lot of the demos are truly MVC. It could be more MVP or more MVVM. But whatever it is, I think that it established some good patterns that other teams could follow, and that was certainly compelling to us. So the next step was to build a prototype. So way back when, this was in January of 2011, we decided to take the front page of our application, which I'll show you in a little bit, and convert it to Angular. And what we did, we had some pre-existing web services, so we didn't mess with those. We used those. We used our existing markup, basically. We just annotated it with the Angular attributes. We also kept most of our CSS. And as it says here, that took us about 2 days to build this prototype. And the real amazing thing about this was the prototype ended up being about 1/10 of the code size, about 10 times faster than what we had in our ASP.NET version. Now, obviously, we spent a lot more time building that into a real application, and our stats actually got a little bit better. But the key point is we got immediate positive feedback from the experience using Angular. Yeah?
When you measure that, are you talking just about the code that you wrote, or is it the code that the client downloads as well?
We're talking about the code that we wrote in order to achieve the same effect. So, in the ASP.NET side, we're taking all of the C# code plus the template code plus any JavaScript that we're sending to the client and comparing that to in Angular, the code that actually retrieves the data, that has the marked up view and whatever controller we use to bind everything together. At the end of the day, it's the same net effect. It's the same UI, but it required less code to get there. Yep.
What kind of ASP application?
I'm sorry?
What kind of ASP application is it?
I'm going to demo it in a few minutes, and I can show you then. All right, so armed with this, and it should say that at the same time, we also because there was this environment of GWT, we also did a GWT prototype, or should I say attempted a GWT prototype. We worked on it for about 2.5 weeks, something basically working, but at that point we started to see diminishing returns. We'd already successfully deployed something in AngularJS. It was a couple hours perusing the documentation. We had a working app. With GWT, we really felt like we could have spent a month on this prototype. Now, granted, we're not GWT experts. I'm sure a GWT expert can come in tomorrow and rewrite something much quicker than we did. But that was the point. I'm bringing in new engineers. I'm building out a team. I don't want to have each of them have a month or longer ramp-up time just to get a basic page working. With AngularJS, we were able to do that pretty much straight out of the way. So our initial strategy, again, I'll demo the app in a little bit, but it's a large app. It has multiple sections. Each section has multiple tabs. Each tab has multiple dialogues. There's lots of information in it. And we were trying to figure out a strategy where maybe we weren't putting all of our eggs in one basket. We wasn't going to be a rewrite from scratch, and then we'd wake up 18 months later and it would just be, we'd flip the switch. Our original strategy was actually around updating the application page by page, view by view. So we would take a section of the app, and that might have multiple pages in it, and we would just make that page in Angular and co-deploy these two applications. And essentially by using a smart routing mechanism, depending on the URL, you'd either go to the Angular version or the old version. So we did this. We actually took an entire third of our app, upgraded to Angular in place, and was co-deploying this with the old ASP.NET, working against the same web services, backend web services written in a combination of C# and Java. And we deployed this last September, almost a year ago, and it worked. It was really cool. But in the end, we decided not to continue pursuing that strategy, and we ended up pursuing a strategy of rewriting the whole thing from scratch. But what was wonderful, we were able to reuse practically everything we had done. Because our views were clean, our controllers were the same, and because there was a layer of abstraction around our backend APIs, which I'll talk about a little bit later, realistically, in about a month, we had kind of rewired all of our existing third of the app over to the new tech stack, and then we just kind of went greenfields for the rest of the application. Why did we make this change? Ultimately, it had nothing to do with the technology. It had to do strategically. We weren't really, when we began this, we were thinking about updating DFA6, which was just a trafficking UI. But now we're really thinking about updating a platform. Well, DoubleClick Digital Marketing Manager is a platform that has many things in it. It's got trafficking as one component, serving, reporting, and ultimately you can't just update one part of that platform and expect that to be a business success. You have to update the entire platform, have it all integrated, and provide a better product for the customer. So in the end, we decided, you know what? Let's take a clean approach to this. Let's have it all be consolidated, new code. And where we are is we just launched this about a month and a half, 2 months ago. And we are migrating over customers. And let's see. So one thing that was really interesting is that when we began this effort to use Angular, there was an incredible amount of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? There are a lot of reasons for this. One was that I think at that time everyone was Gwit, and you're going, you're not Gwit, you're crazy. Gwit is it, you're crazy. I think the second reason is that even today, AngularJS team is small. I think today it's 4 or 5 people, depending on how you count. Back then it was 2. Still, the idea of having a big ads application depend on a small team of 2 seemed a little crazy. And I think some other reasons just had to do with just I think the idea that everyone is zigging and we're zagging, and that freaked people out. So what did we do? We tried convincing them, and then we just simply started lying about it. We went for about 6 months, and we never used the word Angular. We're coding on Angular every day. We're having a great old time. We're training new developers. And when people asked, oh, how's it going? What are you using? We're using a JavaScript framework, a custom JavaScript framework. And that's not necessarily the political strategy I would recommend, except that at the end of that 6 months, we released that first version, that sort of side-by-side version. It worked perfectly. Nobody thought we could do it that quickly, and we had trained a bunch of new people. And at that point, AngularJS was no longer a dirty word. And the story gets even better. Now, flash forward, 18 months after we started, 12 months after it was a dirty word, we have multiple teams in Google switching to Angular, from Gwit to Angular. So across our entire platform and beyond, AngularJS has kind of been latched in. So it's really a good outcome.
So you killed Gwit.
I'd love to take credit for that, but I did not. So I'm going to be giving 2 demos, a before and after picture, if you will. The first one is DFA 6. It's not sexy. It's not wonderful. I'm just showing it to you to give you a sort of sense of where we came from. And then I'll do a longer demo about DFA 7. Again, I don't want to bore you with the details of an advertising application. I just want to give you a sense of some of the pieces of work that we did in the application, reusable widgets and that kind of thing. All right. So we first look at DFA. Yeah.
The legacy architecture that you had in DFA 6, did that come out of DoubleClick where it was acquired by Google?
Yes.
Or why it was built that way?
Yes. In fact, at the time of acquisition, the DoubleClick team was just finishing a full rewrite from DFA 5, which was yet a different technology. So DFA 16 was allowed to sort of finish their upgrade, and now we're doing it all over again.
They actually chose that crazy hybrid stack of Java, C#, and Oracle.
Yes. Yes.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so this will be DFA 6. Okay, so I'll just guide you through this a little bit. Again, this application its user base is traffickers. So these traffickers are people at these agencies or advertisers, and their sole job is to receive instructions from people called media planners, who are figuring out like where should I put my advertising spend, how will I get the most people clicking on my ads, buying my cameras. They receive these instructions from the media planners, and their goal is to upload all the artwork that they receive from the creative agency and create all these objects that sort of define how this campaign will play out on the internet. So in this app, this trafficking front end is really all about those actions, creating the campaigns, creating the ads, creating the placements, creating the creatives. These are our objects that we deal with. And in essence, this trafficking application, certainly in the older version, is nothing more than forms over data. I'll go to, for example, this is a list of campaigns, and and I will click on a particular campaign, and inside that campaign, I have lists of ads, lists of creatives. Every one of these things has a properties page. So, for example, the media plan refers to a list of placements. In fact, that's what we call it in the new thing. And a placement is nothing more than a piece of inventory, on the publisher site. I can click on that. It has this really horrible thing. One thing you might notice is DFA 6 is quite slow. We'll see in DFA 7 how we've actually been able to prove that quite a bit. We've got forms, and the one thing I'll point out before moving to DFA 7 is that the page you're looking at right now, right here, is the campaigns list page. This is our application landing page. This was the page we did for our prototype. And again, we took the exact same markup, exact same CSS, adorned it with Angular, wired it to the same web services, and this is where we began. All right, so now let's go to DFA 7. There we are. Okay, so much is the same, yet much is different. We're still, for at least in the older part of even the DFA 7, we're still forms over data. But we have a lot of cool little features we add. So the first one you can see, if I scroll, I apologize that GVC is a little slow here. You'll see that the header of the table sticks to the top. Right? This was actually a feature of our custom grid control, which I'll demo a few more features a little bit later. It's pretty wild and woolly. We go into a campaign. Another thing you'll notice, there's that little loading at the top. So we wrote directives, for dealing with, ephemeral messages and sticky messages, and that's a service. How many people are actually program in Angular? Okay, a good many of you. I'm not assuming in this talk much in the way of Angular knowledge, but for those out there, I'll throw out a couple words. So we have that little butter bar message represented as a combination of a service and widget. Tabs, again, are reusable widget, directive. So let me go and show you some other cool stuff. Probably the coolest thing is a new feature that was just launched. Ooh, let me go to a better campaign. 1 second. So, as I mentioned, this application, the workflow historically was, all right, I go to this list, create an object. Then I go to that object, go to its related list for something else and create another object. So this is not great for a workflow. So one of the things we've done in DFA 7 is we introduced this new thing. Sorry, 1 second. There's a new thing called Campaign Explorer. And if I can find a campaign with data in it, this will be an awesome, there we go. Okay, so the key idea here was that since we don't know all the different ways that people work, let's give them a UI that lets them reassemble the UI around their particular needs. So as I said, we have this hierarchy of objects, sites, placements, ads, and creatives. One of this thing that this new feature does allows us to hide and remove dimensions. So I can say, I just want to see which creatives are on which sites. I can hide the dimensions and show them. Another thing is I can add and remove columns. Okay, not a big deal. But one of the things we did in our custom OmniGrid control is we added the ability, I don't know if you can see this, is to create slidable panels. Again, this is all done pure Angular. So I'm scrolling here, and you can see there's like a little shadow showing that there's stuff, columns not being hidden. And this all just updates and so forth. One of the other major pieces, if I go to, for example, a particular ad, these little widgets are actually embedded jQuery date-time controls, which we hope to get rid of very soon. But another thing that's pretty cool is we wrote, so that grid control, we call an OmniGrid. And we also have support for something called an Omni list. Let's actually see if I can find a better example of this in action. Let's go to campaigns. So I can, let's say I've got, I want to filter this list of campaigns by advertiser. So this Omni list control, again, pure Angular, no other jQuery or anything like that, lets me do things like search for, let's see if I got, Here we go. Auto, I can filter that down. I've got keyboard support. This supports single select, multi-select. And there's a bunch of other controls in here as well. For example, we have this carousel control, which is very cool. So for example, let's say I'm filtering by auto. I'm sorry, this particular advertiser. Oops. Maybe I'll find one with an advertiser in it. Hold on a minute. Maybe one more chance. Trying to find a advertiser with more than one.
Maybe you should just filter by status.
Oh, excellent idea. So let's do. Wow, getting no love. How about this? How about this? There we go. Okay, so what I wanted to demonstrate is I've got a filter applied to a list, and I can go into this particular campaign, and now I have a carousel up here that I can go through different campaigns that's referring to the previous list. And again, we're doing this in Angular by encapsulating carousel state in a combination of the location bar and a service, and then this carousel is a widget that interacts with that service. So that's all I'm really going to demo of the application, just to give you a sense of what it is. So let's talk a little bit about the architecture of this application. So the application really has, we have two teams. We got a back-end team and a front-end team. The back-end was also rewritten from scratch. It used to be that Java on JBoss against an Oracle back-end. Now it's Java on Linux, and it is using a proprietary Google data store. The key point is it's really kind of outside the scope of this conversation, but it's a fresh, fast, new backend, and it works great. But this backend is using an RPC method that's not exposable on the internet. It only works inside of Google. So one of the first design questions we had is how are we going to expose this data to a JavaScript client application? So what we did architecturally is introduce a REST API, a RESTful JSON Web Services API. We wrote this in Java. Again, it's deployed in Linux and in Google's fancy cloud infrastructure. And it uses something called Jersey, which is just a reference implementation for building easy REST APIs using Java annotations. And it lets us do things like, post campaigns would create a new campaign, get campaigns gets a list of campaigns, and so forth. And the key point is this REST API sits above the back end. It's part of the front end. And it gives us a bunch of different things. It gives us authentication, allows us to aggregate data, transform data. For example, we have more than our main backend is trafficking, but we also pull in data from reporting, from other integrations within Google. And the REST API is essentially that integration layer for that type of work. So above that, we have our UI. And there were a number of different design issues that we had to think through as we were building out this UI. So one of the first things that we had to grapple with was single-page architecture. This was something very foreign, to the ASP.NET world. We were dealing with an application where there really is an index.html and everything else is happening on the client. And this affected our architecture in two ways. One is, how do you deal with common view content? So in .NET, in .NET, we had this notion of master pages, nested master pages, so that if you look at our app, we have this header, which is true for the entire application. Oh, I'm sorry. GVC is a little slow. Keep going. Keep going. Okay, so we've got this section up here, which is sort of a common header across the entire application. We've got this sort of second section out here, which is a common header within a section, and then we've got the tabs, and then we've got within each section we've got an action bar that's repeatable. So the question was, in the single page architecture, if we don't have nested master pages, how do we figure out how to get reusability across the app? And the second concern was bookmarkability. In DFA6, you could not really bookmark a page. In fact, it was even worse than that. You couldn't even open two tabs to the same data without screwing it up. So in DFA7, we were very much concerned with how do we make it deep linkable, and how do we surface states of the application, and trying to figure out which states should be bookmarkable. So we've had lots of debates with UX and amongst engineering. For example, if I've got a page and it opens up a dialog, should that state of the application be bookmarked? If I send you that bookmark, should the dialog appear? Ultimately, we decided absolutely not. It should not. Similarly, there are states of the application. For example, if I apply a filter and then I go to edit those things in batch, so that's a feature that we have in Campaign Explorer. When I bookmark that and I send it to you, the same items should be in the result, but I should not be in that edit mode. Anything that's a mode or a dialog is not bookmarkable, but things like the set of things that you're working on are. So these were some of the things we had to work through. And again, for common view content, ultimately in Angular you're allowed to fit some stuff in index.html, and that's sort of common through. But the rest of the way, we ended up using directives as a means for our reusability. And trying to figure out the right mix of directives and how to make sure that they adapt to surrounding content was something that we talked about for a while. So jQuery, when we were started, we were very excited about jQuery, and it's still something we use throughout our directives. But as time has gone on, we try to figure out how much of jQuery do we really want to use, and what are its limits. So we've used jQuery UI components for a while, and we still have a couple in there, like the datetime widget. I think we also have dialog widget. But ultimately, we ended up using sort of less and less of sort of the broad jQuery, and more of those things that are actually in the compatibility layer. And as well, I'll talk a little bit later, we use a range of different libraries, and so many of the things that we may have used to use for jQuery in the past, we don't seem to use anymore. So I can imagine a future where we've eliminated all jQuery UI dependencies, and also potentially the glimmer of eliminating a dependency on jQuery proper. But that still remains a hope and a goal, not really something we've achieved yet. In our UI, we also mix in a bunch of other things. So, for example, we use something called _JS. How many people have used underscore? So it's a really wonderful library that brings in a lot of functional programming and utility functions. And we found it to be hugely useful for us. And so it's probably like the #1 third-party JavaScript. And what's nice is it just works perfectly fine with everything else. One of the things we had to figure out is, another thing we use is Clojure. And Clojure, underscore, jQuery, Angular have significant overlapping in functionality. Like all of them implement, the equivalent of isString, isNumber. And so one of the things we had to figure out is, because we didn't want a code base where one developer uses the jQuery version, another one uses the underscore version, and another one uses the Clojure version. And so we kind of debated this out, and we ultimately settled on using Clojure for all those core utility functions. And why? Well, because we ultimately have to use a bit of Clojure anyway, because I'll talk about our build a little bit. We rely on the Clojure compiler, and we rely on it for package and dependency management. We do Goog require and Goog provide throughout our application so that we know which things require which things. And the Clojure compiler, actually, when it does static analysis of your JavaScript, it leverages the fact when you use the Goog version. So if you do Goog isNumber, the Clojure compiler actually says, oh, that means, in the if block after this thing, I can assume it's a number. Whereas if you use, underscore isNumber or something like that, or Angular isNumber, it has no additional knowledge. It can do whatever its static analysis wants to do, but it doesn't benefit from that extra hint it gets from the Goog versions. So while we don't use Clojure at all for like UI widgets or anything like that, we do use Clojure sprinkled throughout, for certain data structures and core utility functions. Another thing we introduced recently that we really like is Less, the CSS compiler. Google has its own CSS compiler. We don't use it. Less made a lot more sense. It's very similar to CSS. A valid CSS file is also a valid Less file, although the reverse is not true. The other thing is, I think, again, we're trying to grow our team. A lot of people out in the industry were already familiar with Less. The benefits were huge. As we get into a very large application, one of the things you'd struggle with is how do I make the properties page in one part of the app look like the properties page in the other part of the app? How is it that when a UX guy says, oh, I got the most fabulous new blue we should change to, how do I make sure that that blue actually gets rolled out across the entire app correctly, not just on some pages or some controls? So the less CSS compiler allows us to define functions and constants and other things like that help us get all those things applied correctly throughout the entire application. As well, something we've started to do recently is we've worked harder at making reusable libraries for Angular controls and directives and services that can be picked up and used by Angular teams at Google. And the less CSS compiler gave us some ability to essentially compile just the set of CSS that needs to go with that package versus having to pick apart an entire CSS file and figure out which needs to go with which package. The last thing I'll call out is we use HTML5 boilerplate. This is it basically defines what our index.html looks like. It gives us certain flags for feature detection for IE and things like that. Yeah, that's about it. All right, so build, compilation, and minification. We use Clojure compiler as our compiler. Our build system is based on a Google internal build system. It's if you've used Rake or Make or anything like that, it's a little different, but still serves the same end goals. I think some of the interesting things we do here is really in our build is really around localization. So I'll come back to this point when I talk about localization. The other key decision we had is what server-side templating and server-side rendering do we do, if any? For approximately the first 17 months or so of the project, we said none, absolutely none. We launched with our application and we served all files statically. So that's essentially index.html was a static file, all the JavaScript, all the CSS, everything was a static file. And the thinking behind this was that maximizes our use of caching. Essentially, with all static files, we can put, if we could properly encode the URLs with immutable URLs, we could basically put this all on Google's Edge servers. And no matter where you were, if you had loaded that application once and we hadn't updated the version, you wouldn't have to download any of the files at all. So that was basically the idea. In practice, we never got the full payoff of that for a couple of reasons. One is solving the problem of versioned immutable URLs without any kind of server-side help is actually pretty challenging. And the second thing is we realized that there were things that we wanted to do on the server side ultimately that forced our hand. So as of today, we actually render our index.html on the server. We use Soy, which is just a server-side templating language. Publicly, it's known as Clojure templates. And what we do in there is, we used to, when it came to authentication, we'd serve up index.html to unauthenticated users. And the very first time the page booted up, we would ask for, hey, who's logged in? And to the REST API. And if that returned forbidden, 403 forbidden, then we would go and redirect the user to log in with their Gaia credentials, their Google credentials. So what we do now, though, is that when in index.soy that we actually authenticate the user before we return anything. As well, we at that time determine all of the permissions and features that they have available to them. So one of the other reasons that forced our hand on server-side templating is we wanted the ability to show or hide features. So for example, let's say the product manager say we're releasing this awesome campaign Explorer feature, and we want to do it exactly on October 1st. But our production release isn't on October 1st; it's on September 26th, and we want to figure out how do we make this feature apply without redeploying. And so one of the ways we can do that is through feature flags. And as well, we can say like, okay, I want this feature to be live in dev and QA, but not in prod. And so the way we ended up implementing this is on the server, when we render index.soy, we look up all the different features that are enabled for you, and we encode them all into the HTML response. It's just like a little payload in there. And then we can conditionally also load bundles, so we can conditionally include script tags and load bundles, and so that when you finally get the application, we can strip out a whole portion of code that's not enabled for you live. And there's no view source hack on that. It's just not there. So that's why we ultimately did server-side rendering of index.soy. We don't expect it to go much beyond that, though. Third-party controls. Like I said, we have a few in there. We used to have a few more, but they're gradually dwindling away. The few that we're forced to use are some internal ones based on Clojure. We wrap, for example, there's a Google feedback feature. It's really cool. You can say send feedback and get a little dialogue that comes up and says, hey, let me help you take a screenshot of this page and blank out anything that's like sensitive data, and we'll send it into our support staff. So that Google feedback widget comes from internally. It's a Clojure widget, which we've wrapped as Angular. We also use a small number of things like the date time widget and so forth. But our goal ultimately is to do more and more of these as like fresh, clean Angular widgets. That's why we've invested a lot in our grid control, our custom list control. We're going to be doing a date time widget soon because the existing ones just don't serve our needs. Yep.
What kind of browsers are you targeting with this? Is there like a specific version that you're just considering invalid?
So Google Consumer Apps has a public policy of browser support that says the 2 most recent released versions of any of any browser. So not any, not Conqueror, for example, but like Safari, Internet Explorer, Firefox, and Chrome. So we follow that almost to the letter. We do support IE8. And when IE 10 comes out, we're going to have a tussle with product management to like hopefully get rid of IE8, but that's not set in stone. But meanwhile, everything else we're basically keeping the 2 most recent versions. The only one we really fight with nowadays is IE8.
What about Angular itself? Are they going to drop IE8? Any chance?
I can't speak for Angular. Basically, like I said, we're their biggest customer, and if we're supporting IE8, I'm just going to keep IMing with Igor all day long until it works with IE8. All right, and like I said, we've implemented a lot of our controls. So how many people in the room actually have international applications? Like they're translated into different languages? Okay, so as some of you know, internationalization falls into 2 categories. It's translation and localization. So translation is actually pretty straightforward for us at Google. So we do 2 things. One is Clojure gives us the ability to mark up in JavaScript any messages. There's a goog.message, and we can say, all right, this is something that needs to be extracted. Furthermore, we created our own little syntax that's used in HTML. Oops. All right, I'm going to finish this talk quick. Yeah, except I got a new MacBook Air that doesn't have the right power port. Let's see if I can. So this our own little custom syntax is based off of wiki syntax. So it's this bracket, bracket, vertical bar, bracket, bracket. So the first part here is the message to be translated. The second part is the description that's sent to the translator. Is that a new one? Oh, awesome! You're a rock star. Can you find a plug? Thank you. And so both of these JavaScript messages and these custom messages are extracted during our build. So the first part, the goog.message, is extracted by the Clojure compiler. This part is extracted by a custom Python script that we wrote. So during our build, all these messages get pulled out. They get formatted into a sort of database file, and they get sent to our internal translation database. And then when we complete the build, we pull down the database of translated messages, and then for each language, we create a clone of all our static files, all of our JavaScript and views, and put them in locale subdirectories. So if you actually were to go onto our web server and look at our static files, there's going to be an ENUS subdirectory, a ES subdirectory, a DE subdirectory, and so forth. And then through some magic of our REST API, as soon as you log in, we set a cookie that says, oh yeah, this person is interested in the Spanish version. And so then when they come in, that cookie is used to detect your locale. And then we set that locale, and then our static file servlet that serves up these files just simply redirects to the subdirectory and serves all the files out of there. And what we do for development time, this was actually kind of a cool insight, is this markup here, this wiki listen. Thank you very much. If we didn't do anything, when you're in development mode, right, we're not looking at the compiled version, but the one you're actually, you would normally see all this like additional bracket and translated messages. So we wrote an Angular interpolation service that actually fixes this up. So an interpolation service in Angular is what implements the binding syntax, like the squirrely brackets. It knows at that particular time how to read that, translate that into something else, so that when you view the page in development mode, you're not seeing, the binding syntax. You're actually seeing, what it evaluated to. So we used the same idea. We extended the interpolation service so that whenever it sees this translation syntax, it just strips it all off and just keeps the message. So it works both in production, where it gets translated to real messages, and in development, where it just strips off the extra syntax. For localization, so this by means formatting dates, times, and numbers, it's a little bit more difficult. In fact, it's a lot more difficult in a JavaScript application. The main reason is most browser applications can deal well with the invariant locale, and they can deal with the current locale, whatever the operating system is set at. Dealing with other locales is where it gets a little challenging, because there's not a lot of libraries that just like ship down all the world's locale information into every browser app. Doing this on the server, it would be much easier. In fact, we do a lot of, there's a use case for our application where you've got, the poor trafficker sitting in New York, his client is in London, but the campaign is running in Germany, all of which have different time zones. So when the guy in New York, normally he's looking at things in Eastern time, but the guy in London says, no, I want this to start, at 1 a.m. my time, and then I want you to verify that that's at the lunchtime in Germany. And so they need to switch between all those time zones. That we tried to do on the client, it just got too hard. So now we actually, we asked the REST API, hey, when I ask you for data, here's an explicit time zone, and you send it back to me in an ISO 8601 date that has that time zone offset. And for like number formatting, again, AngularJS recently released a bunch of localization tools that help with this somewhat. We haven't switched to them yet. We currently rely on Clojure, but Clojure is a little problematic because, again, those things are determined statically. So when we create a copy for a subfolder for Spain and in US, the locale version of format number is predefined at that time. So when you get into weird situations where where in the UI, like in some states where it's formatted by Clojure, it's done correctly, but then if you click on it and put it into editing mode, the underlying browser formats it incorrectly. So we got a little bit more work to do on getting this exactly right. And the last, I think, major design issue was how to achieve caching. So with an app like ours, you can actually do caching a lot of different levels. So we do it at the server. So every time our REST API calls the back end, if it knows that you have data that's slowly changing, it will store it in memory and just cache it. Next level up is HTTP caching. So every time the REST API sends data, it does two things. One, it sets last modified header, and as well it sets an E tag. It essentially hashes all the data, the JSON data, and sends it out there. So the next time the browser says, hey, I want this particular piece of data, the REST API will rehash the response from the back end, determine does it match, and if not, if it does match, it'll just go and set a not modified. Yeah.
Why would you send a last modified if you're also?
I think we do it based on resource. I think most of the time we use the E tag. I think there just maybe a last few stranglers, for example, where it just wasn't convenient to calculate the E tag. No. It's mostly E tag for the data. I just believe that there are a few stragglers where they're still using last modified. Of course, there's browser level caching, which is related to what we're just talking about. One of the other things we tried, like we talked about, is like edge caching. To the extent possible, we always set caching to expiry. It can be based on anywhere from 0 to 24 hours. So in dev, we set it all to 0 hours. In production, we try to set it to 4 hours, I think, most of the time. And we can do better at that if we have these immutable version URLs. for which we would need server-side support. So we're working on that too. The HTTP service in Angular also has support for caching. And finally, at the application level too, we hold on to some data. So there's a lot of different levels where we can get caching and get the right kind of refresh rates that we need. Okay, so just very quickly, a little bit about how my team, gets stuff done. We have 14 software engineers. A few of them are trickled through here as spies. So we have 4 test engineers, so a mixture of software engineers and tests and actual test engineers. We have 4 UX folks, 2 researchers, 2 designers, a documentation writer, and of course there's a whole bunch of people that we rely on as well. Product managers, localization project managers, service support, and lots of great folks, including the Angular team, who we are in constant contact with and help us a lot. Yeah?
How does that 14 break up?
This is all front end, and we have 3 folks that are dedicated to the REST API, which again is part of the front end, and then we've got all the rest are UI JavaScript engineers. The back end itself has its own, I think, 10 people. So, our division of labor is, yes?
So, I have a question. So, recently I watched a video of AngularJS in which the video's name was, he mentioned that they're moving away from JS test driver to test tackler, but I couldn't find a download of test tackler. So,
Yep.
So, are you guys using test tackler or JS test driver?
I'll talk about it in a couple minutes. The short answer is we're in transition. So we currently rely on JS Test Driver, and we have a working version on Testacular, but for various reasons it doesn't yet fully integrate into our continuous integration server and stuff. But Vojta, who's also on the AngularJS team, is working feverishly to help us get on Testacular.
Okay, but I have another question.
Sure.
Which is that with JS test driver, I was trying that essentially I was able to run either the unit test suite or the integration test suite. We're trying to run both at the same time, even though they're not running the same code. The second one would not start. So I was just wondering whether you guys came to this issue or not.
No, but we do run them as separate test runs. So we run our unit tests, and then separately we run our integration tests. I'll talk a little bit about that too. So one of the things that's troubled me and a lot of the team is development environment. So across our team of 14 folks, we still don't have a standard development environment. And some of us use Eclipse, some of us use WebStorm, some of us use IntelliJ, some of us use Vim. I use Vim. Some of us use Sublime Text, and use a terminal window. And I think while all of us individually are fine with that, I think a recurring piece of feedback that I've heard from people joining the team is, I'm trying to learn so much stuff. Why can't you just tell me what environment I should use and let that work, and then let me customize my workflow later on? And I think that the real reason we haven't done that is because we haven't found one that seems to work really well. So I think this is an area of investment that Google is working on, but also some of the other teams. So automated testing. So this comes to your point. So we use the standard AngularJS test suite for the most part. We use Jasmine against Test Driver. We have 99% plus unit test coverage. The one area where I think AngularJS kind of failed us a little bit, and I'll talk about this later on, is Angular Scenarios was their solution for end-to-end integration testing, and it just never worked with us. We tried. It was an area where we felt like it was not well documented. It required a high level of understanding. It is possible to write AngularJS scenario tests that work, but to do so, I think, requires more thought and skill than on average. So right now, all of our integration tests are written in Java on WebDriver. We have a few remaining on AngularJS, and we're trying to get rid of them. I was just found out that there's actually a JavaScript adapter for WebDriver, so we might actually use that instead. Sorry, question?
What is 99% unit testing?
So when we run our test suite, we generate code coverage. And that code coverage gives us a report that says, all this source code was executed at line-by-line level. So we can actually see, we can load up any, with our internal tools, we can load up any JavaScript file, and it'll paint all the lines green that were executed by a test, and any line that was not executed will be painted red. And they aggregate those up into reports, line by line.
Yeah, like you hit an if statement and you on one branch, will it count it as green or red?
It'll count the one branch you went down as green, and then the other branch red.
If you have like a complex expression of one line that short circuited it would not. You just didn't prove that you touched all of those.
Yes,
It's on the line level.
yeah. It's not a perfect management measure, but
So what tool are you using for generating these code coverage reports?
Clojure compiler itself generates the code data, but the visualization of it is an internal Google tool. But there's a lot of CI tools that, given the code coverage data in the correct form, will display it correctly.
It's actually an area I'm looking into a lot. Is trying to find a good JavaScript code coverage tool. And there's a lot out there that are really fiddly to set up, and I don't think you have one.
I do. I can share it with you. Question in the back?
Yeah, are you doing any unit testing fixtures, or are you relying solely on your integration system?
We have a very large set of test doubles. So we have fake objects. We have spies, that help. We also have mock objects to return some of these, test fakes. We used Angular's dependency injection to help inject alternate versions of services. So our unit tests are, in fact, unit tests. We try to insulate them as much as possible.
For instance, your practice for doing installation.
Yep.
Are you doing any small fixtures?
It's a mix.
Sometimes we'll, there's a couple that use like a month version of jQuery, but for the most part, like the director doesn't know how to do it, only a good test.
Yeah, so many times we're working on a document fragment that we create in the directive, in the Jasmine test, and then validating that the fragment gets mutated in the correct way. Yep. All right, so coming down the home stretch here. Thanks for staying awake. So just quickly, what are some of the, looking back at our experience, what were some of the pros and cons and other realities of Angular? So I think one of the key advantages, even after using this for a year and a half, is that the fact that it sticks to standard web technologies has really been a payoff for us. One is anytime somebody comes up with a new technique in CSS or JavaScript, we can readily advance it. There's no major integration work. When we go out to the marketplace to find people, there's a lot of people already aware of these technologies. So I think that's all very key. As well, like, as browsers improve, our implementation improves as well. I think the other advantage that has just paid dividends many times over is this, testing is just deeply ingrained in the Angular way. I think you spend any time talking with Igor and Mishko from the Angular team, and they're always talking about how they run tests. I think one of the big payoffs, fortunately many of you not had to go through this, but because we adopted Angular back at version 0.7, we've had many painful upgrades along the way. 0.7 to 0.8 hurt. 0.8 to 0.9 was absolutely brutal. Going to 1.0 was bad. But the thing that actually worked really well for us is that we had a really strong test suite. And without that test suite, it would have been impossible to do these upgrades. What actually happened is a couple folks in the Angular team came down with us to help do this upgrade. And we had, 3,000 tests. And we started, did the upgrade, and it's like 2,999 failed. And over the course of, I guess it was about a week and a half, it's just making the test pass. And ultimately, we got all the tests to pass. And, that's just a testament, to the value of testing in general. But I think just because so much of the Angular Zen, the Angular approach, is all like, how do I test my controllers and services and directives, and having a story for all that, made sure that even as we did these painful upgrades, we were able to assert our quality. Velocity development, totally awesome. We can go write stuff really quickly, much quicker than any of the other technologies we looked at. I mean, we have had developers write entire pages in a few hours, and it's really quite nice. Huge boon for the team. Like really passionate, attentive AngularJS team. They've been very helpful to us, but they're also helpful to the entire community, and that's the last part. Like it used to be that I could keep up with all the Angular lists and stuff. Now I can't. I blink and there's like 500 unread threads, and there's a tremendous amount of activity. And not only is people like Igor and Mishko very active in that community, but there's a lot of people outside of Google who have no relationship to the project, who are very insightful in responding and building that community. So looking back, I'm really sold on AngularJS, just almost purely from its community as well as its technology. A few disadvantages. Angular scenarios, don't like it. I wish it did. I would love to write my end-to-end integration tests in JavaScript, but scenarios itself, I think it just has too high a conceptual count, it's too poorly documented, and it just doesn't work the way we want it to. Unit testing technologies, I hear it's in flux. So this is the whole JS test driver moving to Testacular, and there's some attempts to use like Phantom JS and other things like that. Whatever Angular ends up with, I'm sure it's fine, but if you're starting something today, the story's a little muddy. You're supposed to use Testacular, but like a lot of other projects you'll see in the wild are still using JS test driver. So I think this is just a phase it'll hopefully get out of. And then finally, one disadvantage is I find that AngularJS documentation even though it's markedly improved over where it used to be, it's still quite buggy and missing a lot of conceptual content. I think like the API level reference is not bad, but you don't really get that sort of advice that you get from like somebody who's worked with Angular for a year. There's none of that stuff in the documentation really says this is the Angular way. This is these are the key ideas. This is the philosophy. I think that's still to come. Maybe one of you guys will write a book someday. That'd be great. And finally, just a few realities. Angular used to be much simpler. Back when we started, I think the scope of Angular was much smaller. It tried to do fewer things. As we flash forward to the current day, Angular is much more flexible, much more powerful. And if you ask Igor, it's much more flexible, more powerful, but it's also become a lot more complex. And if you ask Igor, it's our fault. DFA made it this way because we essentially kept saying, why can't I do this? Why can't I do that? And we've grown it. I don't know if I totally agree it's our fault, but and this next line kind of puts a fine point on it. Dependency injection is an awesome thing. But if you're a typical JavaScript developer, you may not had a lot of exposure to it. If you came from Java or .NET and you've used, Spring or Juice or Ninject or one of these other things, dependency injection will make complete sense to you. But if you're just trying to get a standard run-of-the-mill JavaScript developer to write an AngularJS application, the first thing that just hits you in the face is like, what's a module? Why do I need these modules? And it's presented in the documentation as just kind of a bit of boilerplate that you have to do. There's actually a rhyme or reason to it. In fact, the Angular's module system is cloned almost entirely off of Juice, which is the Java version. If you understand Juice, you understand pretty much the Angular version dependency injection. But this is a level of complexity that I think raises the barrier of entry to this application, and that didn't exist in the same weight as before. Yep.
So I don't actually know anything about Angular's modules, but they're really confusing because JavaScript has this module concept floating around already.
Which is totally different. So, the AMD modules world is really about how to take a large body of JavaScript and create bundles out of it that can be conditionally loaded or asynchronously loaded. That's not at all. In fact, I was talking with one of my developers on my team about this morning. That's not at all what Angular modules are about. Angular modules are about sort of classical dependency injection. Given a bunch of interfaces, right? Which concrete classes should I plug into those those interfaces, right? So a Angular module, in a sense, performs its main function is just simply saying, all right, which concrete service, that's already loaded, will I plug into a a class that's asking for that service. So like $HTTP, like which implementation of $HTTP should I hand off to a class that's plugging it? And it also deals with how to fill in all those different constructor parameters. The other thing Angular modules does, which is not really as much part of Juice, is it gives you like a place to put a little bit of code when the application bootstraps. But the main thing is all about configuration. And what I was talking about with my engineer this morning is he said, but Angular doesn't actually conditionally load anything. Like I could have 2 HTTP implementations, but like the Angular doesn't help me conditionally load one or the other. You're right, it doesn't do that. It would just simply say, given that both are loaded or both their names are valid, which one I can plug in. So that is a little confusing, but that goes to my point, which is that like this stuff has gotten a little bit more complex, and that's a risk.
Does Angular integrate well with normal CommonJS or AMD modules?
Sure, it's just they're completely orthogonal to each other. So
it doesn't try to create its own module system in any way.
no. So as a perfect example, so this is the concrete example we're talking about. Let's say that I had a major feature. Like our Campaign Explorer. And in the future, I have 2 versions of it. I got a V1 and a V2. And let's say there were some services around that, and like I have a particular class that wants a campaigns resource, right? Well, depending on the state of how the application is loaded, I either want the V1 or the V2, right? So if both are compiled into the application, then the Angular will deal with, which one do you want? But if you actually want to sort of conditionally load one of those 2, you can define them as AMD or AMD modules, and then have some other mechanism to say I want one loaded or the other, and just the Angular module has to be in sync with that and not try to reference the one that wasn't loaded. Anyway. Angular does not attempt to solve all key problems in large-scale web application design. It's not everything to everyone. You still have to figure out caching and performance and that kind of stuff as well. There's a real danger in Angular to falling into the trap of monolithic applications. So, for example, we have a very large feature, where we've got a controller with nearly 3,000 lines of code. That's not a great outcome. I don't care how sophisticated your controller is. And I think unless you're very careful, you need to figure out how to prevent that type of outcome. And AngularJS doesn't really give you that kind of patterns. They don't know the answer to these things. And trying to figure out, how do I make an application scale? If I'm keeping adding features onto this thing, how do I prevent a 5,000 line controller? So there's a lot of things that still have to be use your own thinking about. And finally, mixing client-side and server-side templating is pretty messy. Like we're doing a little bit now, but that's probably we're trying to limit it. But in the future, it may be unavoidable. Like there may be a reality where a lot of things we're talking about at Google right now is how do I make my application indexable by a web crawler, right? If it's all rendered in client-side server script, there is nothing to index effectively, right? Unless you've got a very smart web crawler. So one of the things that people are talking about is how do I get the server to at least partially render HTML, and be able to respond to that, ship that HTML out to the client, and then overlay sort of JavaScript behavior on top of that. So coming down the pike, I'm sure there's going to be some solution proposed where you're mixing these 2 modes, and I think that stuff is still not well understood. You had a question?
Yeah, more of a comment than a question. I kind of wanted to digress to the conversation about AMD.
Yep.
So when I first started using Angular, one of the first pieces of anxiety I had was, how are these modules like or not like AMD? And the thing is, people use things like require, these asynchronous module definition patterns, differently than I think they're supposed to. And I think one of the ways people often use them is to isolate bits of code. The asynchronous loading and conditional loading is sort of secondary. And so what I found in a couple of the applications that I'm working on with AngularJS is that the Angular modules let me separate concerns in the way that we often do with AMD patterns or AMD libraries like require. And it does that so well that it made me think twice about whether or not I really need asynchronous loading in my application that I'm working on personally. And the one I'm working for at work, we ended up doing a little bit of conditional loading with YetNote, but we found that there's small overlap between what Angular modules do and what these asynchronous module definition patterns do. That you may not need that extra stuff, and so so I'd imagine there's other developers who've seen that and experienced that same anxiety. So.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, not trying to do a back and forth really, but I think that the point of module systems is to isolate units of code, and the asynchronous loading is very secondary. I mean, back in production, we've never worked on a large enough app to have to need to conditionally load. We've always concatenated and minified into one new bundle. But for me, it's more just like you're going with a standard on JS or AMD. Yeah. So that's why I was scared that Angular is like, come along and use our modules in some way, so they could.
Yeah. And so you can get rid of those.
I'll give you one other little gem of information. I was talking with Igor this morning, and I asked the question, when you break up your app into modules, should you break it by type, like controller, services, or by feature? Like, all right, this service widget, whatever. It seemed obvious to me it should be by feature. And when I asked Igor, he said, oh, clearly by feature. And then I said, well, why does the Angular documentation say the opposite? And why did I have this email from Mishko saying the opposite? And the answer was, the Angular team is still figuring it out, right? I thought that they used to feel that this was just the simplest way to use the module system, but now having seen much larger applications like ours and others, it does hew more closely to like our traditional conception of dependency injection, where the modules really should be defined around features. Yep.
Number one, congratulations on your product.
Thank you.
And all the hard work you and your team have done. One of my thoughts from listening to your presentation is that the Angular team is under-resourced, particularly first documentation. I'm sure there's other things. You've listed some things. Also, my question is moving up the stack a bit, YUI from the Yahoo guys, when they've had a similar type of project for corporate level.
Yep.
They very much included widgets. And the Angular, sure, it's got tabs and maybe, a couple, 1, 2 things, but the YUI guys, I think, and they've spoken about this over the years now, I mean, it's an older project, that they found a lot faster, or let's say positive bumps in uptake within the corporation as they introduced widgets that they have worked very hard on. And clearly, you've done hard work on OmniGrid and OmniList. So thoughts about moving that into, one is moving it, or the Angular team picking up higher levels, and obviously related question is your transfer of that IP out either publicly or within Google.
So the first question is about Angular staffing, and I think that they are working very hard on that right now. I don't think that it's ever going to be like a 40-person team, but they're trying to grow, and I know they're trying to grow writers as well. I think the reality is, until recently, it was just, even within Google, an experimental technology. It's not until products like mine, and now we've got an entire growing number of products that have given that team some gravitas to go out and say, hey, we deserve 3 more engineers. And so that's happening. And so I think that's a good thing. As far as moving up the stack, Mishko has talked a lot about that. For example, there's a bunch of, if you all have seen that like Gmail has a new look and feel, and Google Search has a new look and feel. A lot of this, that was a result of an internal project where there was a lot of controls and widgets, designed. And Mishko's talked a lot about, Angular, we'd love to do Angular versions of that or Angular wrappers of that. Just the reality is they have to make choices every day as to what they work on. And I know that they're still they're spending a lot of time and effort really trying to improve the testing story. JS test drivers flaky and slow and whatever, so they're investing in that, and they're investing in some other things. So I think it will come. But the third part about moving up the stack and will we ever share our controls? To be honest, I'd love to. Like, there's no interesting. We're not in the business of reselling software. We sell a service. I would love to put OmniGrid and OmniList out in the open. I think the big open question though is there is no defined best practice for packaging Angular controls, and that's a real challenge for us. Like even we're trying to share OmniGrid and OmniList within multiple teams, and for the most part, we do that today by making a lot of unsafe assumptions. You know, yeah, you're going to have the same look and feel. You're going to do we could put a lot more work into it and figure out how to make it stylable. But even still, every Angular directive requires sometimes a bit of service, a bit of widget, a bit of CSS, a bit of markup. There's no clear way as to how to package that, and even if we did, how you would consume that package. And I think that's the biggest challenge right now to like the Angular team, rolling out a bunch of widgets, is we don't know yet what that packaging mechanism looks like, and until we do, I don't really see how that's going to change.
Just been talking about that package things and I guess like all the JavaScript frameworks out there, but one of the newer ones is Montage.
Yep.
And they do their packaging in Real. I think it's like .real, and then that's how they modularize their UI things with HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Is that something do you like that format, or could you see your widgets working that way?
I'm recording these names, and I'll look up them afterwards. I've never heard of them before. It's a problem that we'll need to solve in order to get past this hump. If there's good ideas out there, good technologies, we're certainly open to them. We just, I haven't seen a solution yet.
Yeah, this is actually like a really active area of debate and discussion in the Node.js community, because all these server-side people are coming, and they're like, well, we also write client-side apps, and we want to use our package manager that we know, and like our best practices that we know how we package these things together. The debate there doesn't really name components.
Yep.
There's like 3 or 4 blog posts in a row responding to each other. How should we do this? And should we create a new registry? Should we reuse package.json from Node? Or should we...
In many ways, that's a simpler problem because we're only talking about JS files.
No. This is the thing, right? Because they're talking about how do we take this practice that we have for server-side JS
and apply it to
and bring it to client-side HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and they're like, should we take the CSS and HTML and turn it into JavaScript files that inject it into the page?
Oh, I see.
So there's a lot of interesting talk. So yeah, I think this is a big area that everybody's thinking.
Totally. All right, so that is all of my talk. I'll take questions in a second. I just want to make one point before I forget. My team is hiring. If any of you are totally awesome AngularJS developers, come see me. I can hook you up with a recruiter. And with that, questions? Yep.
So, we covered first part, and we actually talked about how hard it was to migrate for months between versions.
Yep.
How much code do you actually have to write that's in Angular? Do you actually have people part-time that help Angular developers?
Yeah, so we actually, so Carl is on my team back there. He's one of our senior engineers. Google's famous for its 20% project. While we can debate that percentage, he is a 20% engineer on Angular. We try to contribute, back to them. I don't think we have a huge stamp on it, but we on the actual code. We have a huge stamp on a lot of the requirements and some of the, direction it's taken.
Second question, do you have any benchmarks that you actually try to run code that you're developing, or maybe some internal code against some slower devices? Any those?
Yeah. No. And the reason, I think we have something like 0.013% of our traffic is, on a tablet. It's not that I would love to better support mobile devices, but it's just not part of our product roadmap, and we haven't spent any time really looking into it. I was just reading an article today about a team that's using Angular, I think with Zepto or something like that. That's that's doing it online. I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh, Good Films or something like that.
Yeah.
Or you should go on Google Plus and just go back over that.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, also, like, I think it's probably, at this point, probably comparable performing to a tablet. The YouTube app for PS3 is limited anywhere, so.
It's a slow device.
It is for this purpose. It actually has a tiny amount of memory, and the YouTube team had to work very hard to get it to be performant in that environment. So just because you got a cell processor doesn't actually. Yes.
So I'm curious what browsers DFA5 supported, and if there were any drops to the new version.
So DFA5, which is 2 versions ago, only supported IE6, period. And the reason is because DFA5 used the IE6's built-in XSL processor, so it just received XML from the server and did all this thing. Kind of cool before its time design, but except it just didn't have a lot of browser support. DFA6, which again is the previous version, is basically supported. I think it supports. It definitely supports IE6 and later. It supports like Firefox 3 and later. So it has much broader browser support, but also it's a much simpler API. It can't take advantage of CSS transitions and all this other stuff. So in our current version for DDMM trafficking, aka DFA7, we tried to limit the number of browsers, to make sure we have better automated testing, just limit the number of environments we have to test, but as well so we can take better advantage of web technology and push the quality of the user experience.
So did you get pushback from clients that said, hey, we're using IE7 or 6 or whatever?
We fretted about this for about 6 to 9 months. Then we just watched the Google Analytics on the DFA6 version, and a lot of the older IE versions have just dropped out. Things have been moving towards Chrome, and so I think by the time we actually hit a critical mass, so we have to migrate users from DFA6 to DFA7. It's not just a switch. So I think by the time we hit a critical mass on DFA7, I think most of the thorniest browsers will have nominal traffic. So I'm not too worried about it. Yeah, back.
One of your disadvantages slide hit Mars right on the head. Starting off, Angular just became 1.0 a month ago.
Yep.
And you guys started 18 months ago on this project. Did you spend more or less, or about the amount of time you expected in the upgrades between each version?
Well, I mean, I always hoped it would be like totally painless and we just like recompile it, it would just magically work. So if that was my expectation, it took way more than that. I think our worst and most brutal one was the upgrade from 0.8 to 9. Was that the right? Or 7 to 9? So there was one where it 9 to 10.
Whatever to 10.
Yes, that. All the other ones. Yeah. So yeah, that was by far the most brutal one, and the reason was the Angular team was trying to shove in as many breaking changes before labeling it 1.0 as possible, and that, I mean, and more power to them, but like that was really bad. I think before that though, there was like a day or two of pain, but nothing too brutal. They did some changes where like they eliminated. There used to be this thing called ng auto bind or something, or auto something, and they removed that and added ng bootstrap or ng app, and then they changed it ng thing to ng model, and then so it was like a lot of those things. Some of them were mechanical, but there were some other ones, like for example, in the current version, the idea of a scope and a controller are separate, and that is just a huge, massive breaking change for us, and we still are using a backwards compatibility model to try to figure out how to get there. Largely, we're shackled by a number of different things. Like for example, we use we have a large family of controllers and a classical object hierarchy. If I had to do it all over again, we would not have done that. We would have used mix-ins or some other method of code reuse. Because of that, we can't actually, separate scope and controller unless we do the entire object hierarchy. You can't just do parts of it. There are things like that, where like maybe we're not paying the fee for those upgrades now, but it's a bit of technical debt that we're carrying with us in the quarters to come.
So you mentioned that you're using directors quite a bit. Which style are you using? Are you using the tag, the attribute, the comment, or is that a lot?
Yep. So, in fact, this was one of the things that we helped massaged into shape. So, I use Vim, and I have this plugin called Syntastic, and it complains every time you use, an element it doesn't understand. So, or a, thing. And it annoyed the hell out of me. So I kept complaining to Mishko. It's like, why can't I do like data dash something, and so that I can get this stupid Syntastic thing off my back. And he, of course, one-upped me and came up with this solution where you can do it 4 different ways, right? You can do it, as an attribute with or without the data, with or without the colon, as an element or whatever. And so we exclusively use, data dash on a div or a span. And again, because we want our stuff to go through an HTML validator. If you have all this stuff, it just creates noise during validation.
And last question, has anybody on your team ever looked at using CoffeeScript with Angular?
I'm sure. CoffeeScript doesn't work within a Google place. But like, I know that CoffeeScript works just fine with Angular. I've messed with it at home, and I know that other people have too. It just doesn't work at Google. So. Yeah, exactly.
I'm of the just kind of that way. Angular's stated goal not to have hardware changes like they did to us back so Carson.
Yep. You had a question?
I have a little bit of I haven't actually used Angular. A little bit of trepidation I have, I don't really caught up with this, is declarative templates and having all this extra stuff in your template affects design, and the designer makes something extremely fancy. Do you have anything kind of your app is fairly like admin interfacey?
Yep.
From what we saw, I don't know if you have any more complex requirements around specific visual design elements that might be more than complicated.
I have a good friend, a guy named Charlie Robbins. He's the CEO of a company called Nodejitsu. I don't know if anybody knows it. And that company, basically Charlie, he wrote this alternate sort of framework called Flatiron. Over beers one day with Charlie, I was telling him, we're using AngularJS, and he goes, I can't stand AngularJS because it's too much like Silverlight and WPF, and there's too much crap in the markup. And Flatiron takes the opposite point of view. It's sort of like, all right, all you need in your markup is just IDs and classes, right? And then we'll handle all of the binding and stuff in JavaScript. And the payoff, of course, is if you have designers who are working in Dreamweaver or Coda or what have you, that nothing will get lost in translation. It's a great idea, but he struggled, Flatiron has struggled to deliver the type of functionality of like the two-way binding and all that kind of stuff. It's just there's just so much like visual, sort of disparate. There's so much distance between the JavaScript and the HTML. So it's great for the designer, but the developer has to sort of go back and forth between these two things and make sure the classes line up and make sure if the designer wants to use a different class because it doesn't have semantic meaning, now it just has purely visual meaning, things will break. So I don't think, this is kind of a roundabout to your question. I look at our views today, and they have a lot of Angular cruft on them. But on the other hand, you look at those views, and they're very informative. I can read the view without going to a JavaScript and get a pretty good sense of what's happening, right? It's like, this area is controlled by this controller, and you click on this button, it's going to call the save method on that controller, and this particular thing is going to show or hide based on the value of this property. It's fairly descriptive. So I can see either way, but of course, no one's going to load one of our Angular files up in Dreamweaver and have great success with it. But.
When you're building a small project, when does it make sense to use jQuery over Angular or vice versa?
So I gave this meetup talk in San Francisco last week, and somebody asked a very similar question. And I'll say that the one thing is, classical jQuery development is almost completely opposite from Angular development, and the two don't mix together. When we write Angular apps, use jQuery in a very limited, sandbox way. But if you're a typical, jQuery developer, you've been operating on a completely different assumptions than those that hold up in Angular. So what I mean, so a typical jQuery app is constantly pushing changes onto the DOM, right? So you click on something, it's an event, and jQuery is then reaching out to the DOM, stripping something out, inserting another element, modifying its inner HTML, doing all this type of work. That's not at all how Angular works. And I think when you have a developer go with that mindset into Angular, they get very confused right away. In fact, I had a new engineer who's as a test project tried to do a control, and his project ended up kind of in between these two worlds. In Angular, everything flows through the model, right? So if I want to have the visual change, the view is simply binding to all interesting properties on the model, and when I want the view to change, I just change the model. If you come from an MVC world, that's a kind of a duh, but it's definitely not the way things are done in typical jQuery world. So if you're if you're a developer working on a small app, it doesn't really matter that both of them have pretty much the same value. I would just say that you have to pick one. They're not blendable, and they're not really evolvable either. You can't go from a jQuery and evolve it into an Angular app. So it doesn't really answer your question, but. So just to sum up for people in the room, the only place in an Angular app where you're supposed to interact with the DOM is inside a directive. A directive is the place, the vehicle for interacting with the DOM. And so inside of there, you're free to use whatever jQuery you want, or Clojure, or what have you, and you can do binding events and stuff like that. But once you leave the confines of that directive, jQuery is an unwanted stranger. Right? You do not want it in your controllers. You do not want it anywhere else. And I think that's, we were excited about the fact that inside the context of a directive, we could use all of our mad jQuery skills, but we had to train ourselves. Just do not use jQuery and do not interact with the DOM at all in any way, shape, or form once you get outside of directives.
Actually, another question about caching. I noticed one of the layers was $HTTP.
Yep.
I was wondering if Angular gave you any caching.
That $HTTP is an Angular service, so it does provide caching. So I can't remember, is this in $resource or $HTTP where it does the? I think, yeah. So in $HTTP, like Angular itself will do caching of resource calls. And in fact, we did some recent work where we're trying to manipulate that cache and provide, transform some of that stuff before it gets saved in the Angular cache. Yeah, I don't have much more on that.
Do you encounter any headaches?
Early on we did, because we couldn't really control the Angular cache. This is a long time ago, well before 1.0, and we found things were getting cached or not cached, not when we wanted to, but I haven't noticed any recent problems with it. Yeah.
You mentioned you had 99% code coverage. I was just curious if your engineers are practicing classic TDD, writing test work. Do they have a different workflow for getting those?
Carl, you? No, I mean, I think a lot of the engineers on the team talk a good TDD game, but don't actually practice it on a day-to-day basis. I can't.
You're getting to 99%. So
yes. It's not the same. I mean, I'm a huge test-driven development fan. I would say that what you hear a lot of times on my team is, I just finished the code. It'll take me about 4 or 5 days to write the test, then I'll be done. And again, there's a lot of reasons for that. And not all of them are wrong. For example, I think when you are new to this particular platform or new to a UI, it's really hard to write tests first because you don't even know what it is you're testing. Like you write, so what's your first test when you're writing a new AngularJS app? Is it of a service? Is it of a directive? Is it whatever? Do you even know what those things are different? So I think it requires a bit of fiddling and exploration, and test-driven development doesn't really help with that. But to your second point, oh, you got 99%. It's 99%. What are you complaining about? Well, part of the reason for test-driven development is that it helps control the shape of the code, right? It can actually forestall lots of code that you may be tested, but didn't even need to be written at all if you had actually approached it from like, what is the minimal interface I need for this behavior to work? I also think that some of our test coverage could be claimed as empty testing. Like, yeah, this was just a piece of JavaScript I had to write to get the code coverage tool to mark this thing as green, but is it really like conceptually the right thing to test? So, while I'm very proud of our code coverage numbers, I think it's something of a hollow claim because not all of our tests really capture, the real conceptual understanding. I think in the ideal, you would read your tests and you would learn what the app does and that app and what its behavior is just by reading the tests. Not all of our tests are written with that clarity. Like they're not always descriptive of the behavior. They just simply say, okay, when I set X to whatever, and read that value back out, it's the same.
Also wonder what those code coverage numbers would be with an expression on it. Cover.
Yep.
Did you guys start outside-in testing first? Did you do integration tests first and then drop down to unit?
No, we did unit tests first. And again, part of the reason for that is because Angular scenarios was such a bore. And so we had essentially our team, we want the developers to write all the tests, right? And so they were cranking out unit tests. And then we just had a conceptual block with getting into Angular scenarios. And so while we had 99% unit test coverage, our end-to-end testing was hovering around 3, 4, 5%, really out of whack. And then our test engineers basically stepped in and said, okay, if you guys won't do it, we'll do it. We're writing them in Java, we're doing them in TestDriver, now in WebDriver, and now our integration test coverage is north of like 65, 70%, which is great, and they're probably going to get all the way there. But the core problem is I still have all these JavaScript developers who are not going to write Java WebDriver tests. So the responsibility is in the wrong place. So it's a bit out of whack, and we need to fix it. Yes.
Change subject to quickly. What's it? I know you wrote your own UI controls. Angular. What if I wanted to build a new application? What would be number one UI framework that I would use in Angular? The most painless way. That's always pain to integrate.
When you mean UI framework, what do you mean?
About widgets. Like jQuery UI.
It's really hard to answer that question. I mean, I think the key thing I would say in AngularJS, you can wrap anything. So you want to use Sencha, you want to use jQuery, you want to use whatever, you can. So.
So jQuery UI, for example,
yep.
actually message resolved. It's not just strict CSS or something.
Yes, but in the context of a directive, that's not necessarily an evil thing. It depends on, if you confine its DOM manipulation to, a directive and make sure it's not doing other stuff into your DOM, it works out fine.
So by directive binding is also affected by this. It's how the controls and it doesn't know it's supposed to have the data to some effect nowhere.
Right. So this is where you get into the more vagaries of Angular. Like you can apply. You can say, I want to run this stuff in an apply scope, or I need to manually call digest. There's ways of telling Angular. It's like, ooh, sorry, I need to jiggle the handle here because somebody else messed. Who moved my cheese? I think is the phrase. Somebody else moved my cheese, and you can tell Angular that. Then write controls in Angular.
That's what I heard, yeah.
So
There's a fear amongst the Angular team of that being not very well maintained yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what is well maintained? Nothing?
I don't know. It's not. Most of the time, our manipulation is that hard. Like, we just have to use, like most widgets, like at least in the, like say jQuery UI stuff, they'll have enough events that you can listen to that you can basically say, oh, I need to tell Angular to digest what is not recommending anyone to code yourself.
There's also an Angular UI page that has.
Yep.
Most of the controllers have a scope parameter. Is that something that's specific to the app or to each controller?
So this is the thing I was talking about, the scope controller separation. It's a feature that was added in 1.0. Prior to Angular 1.0, the scope and controller were one and the same. So what does this mean? So if I said this part of your markup was bound to this JavaScript object, that was always the controller. So if I want to say this input is bound to this property, it's going to be a property of the controller. Well, as time went on, we realized this was kind of limiting because I may want to represent, for example, let's say I wanted to do, I have a form, I edit a bunch of stuff and I do validation on it, but I want to implement discard changes, right? And I want to kind of throw everything out. So they started to say, well, what if, I can actually have scope be a separate thing, and that it's just a property of the controller, and then I could have, swap out scopes, and I don't need to have a one-to-one correspondence necessarily to scope and controller. If you come from a .NET round, there's this .NET world, in WPF there's this idea of data context, which is the exact same idea. Like you don't want, the controller to really hold that state. You want the view state to be stored in something else. And so that was this idea. So the scope is you're in control of it. You basically define what that thing is, how it's passed in. The only real design is ultimately, since the controller is where all the actions are, your scope has to kind of mirror those actions because you're no longer binding to the controller, you're binding to the scope, and the scope essentially has to forward those calls onto the controller, which is kind of a pain. But the payoff is you now have some insulation. You can represent view state as different from controller state and mediate when and how information flows to and from the controller.
So if you have two different parts to your form, are you sharing the same scope between those two different controllers that are acting on those two different parts of your form?
You can. So I mean that's the other flexibility, right? Is that I can actually share the same scope amongst multiple controllers, and vice versa. But will that mess up the dependency tracking?
So if you edit one part of the scope from somebody else, from a function and somebody else's controller, will it still know how to track it at that?
It should. I don't see why not, but I don't quote me on that. Yes.
To piggyback on digest and apply, did you guys have to use too much of that? Meaning, was there any jQuery happening outside that to let Angular know through digest?
Yeah, so we used a lot of it, and then we were gradually pruning it out. I think there was a moment in time where we were oh my God, it's not working correctly. Let me throw a digest in there, see if that fixes the problem, right? And then we, as of course of the time, I think we learned more about how and when it works. We're using, apply is actually the recommended way, right? It's here's a function block, and somewhere in that function block, something's going to happen, and you need to jiggle the handle on Angular, and as soon as it leaves that apply block, it'll work. In some cases, we try to move to that mostly. In some cases, you need to manually call digest. But as time moves on and we rely less and less on third-party controls that mess with our DOM, there's less of that type of low-level work with the digest.
So you didn't use jQuery for XHR calls?
We did for a very brief time, but now we're not. We just used the Angular one. Although, again, this is something we continue to think about. We don't love the $ resource service, and we're going to start handcrafting our own resources. We're still, I think, planning on relying on the HTTP service of Angular, but that's somewhere where you could put in your own jQuery implementation there if you wanted to. Any other questions? Well, Well, thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your patience. And again, my team is hiring, so if anybody's interested, let me know. Thanks.